Hi, in this lesson, we'll learn about if statements and control structures. In the last lesson, we learned about Boolean expressions and relational operators. A Boolean expression will evaluate to a true-false value depending on the result of the expression. In this case, the Boolean expression will evaluate to true, as x is in fact greater than y. We used this concept to help us write a program that evaluated whether or not a user was old enough to vote. If the user was the voting age or higher, the Boolean old enough to vote evaluated to true, and false otherwise. We then printed that value into the console. But what if we wanted to print a different response on the console based on a user's response? Instead of displaying whether or not it was true or false, if the user could vote, what if we wanted to print a more personalized or specific response based on the user's response? As of now, we don't currently have a way to do that. However, with if statements, we can easily create programs that allow us to differentiate our responses depending on user input. If statements are used in programming when there are a set of statements that should be executed only when certain conditions are met. In this case, we want to print a specific statement depending on the user's age. The condition is if the user's age is greater than or equal to the voting age, and the statement is whatever we want printed out. This is the general skeleton for writing if statements. After the if keyword, the Boolean expression is written in between parentheses. The Boolean expression is the condition that is being evaluated in the if statement. If that condition is true, then the code within the if statement will be executed. Let's take a look at an example here. In this case, the Boolean expression is age is greater than or equal to 18. The if statement then tests the Boolean expression and executes the code between the curly brackets if the if statement evaluates to true. Because the variable age is in fact greater than 18, you can vote will be printed on the screen. When age does not meet the condition specified in the Boolean expression, the code within the curly brackets will not execute. Another way to look at this is using a flowchart. For a given condition, if it's true, we will execute the code inside an if statement, and then continue to the code that follows. If it's false, we will move directly to the code following the if statement without executing. This diagram demonstrates how if statements disrupt the sequential nature of programs. Taking the previous example, we can see how this looks in flowchart form. Now that we've learned this new way of developing programs, let's use that to revise the exercise that we completed in the last lesson. Let's take the beginning portion of the code that we already wrote, as all of this code is still necessary to get the program to operate correctly. Rather than create a Boolean expression that's stored in a variable, we can simply write an if statement that contains the Boolean expression we want to test. Inside the if statement, we can write the print statement, "you can vote," to indicate to the user that they can vote. Then we can create another if statement that tests whether or not the user is below the voting age. The Boolean expression here tests the condition that age is lower than the voting age. If that condition is met, then "sorry you can't vote" will be displayed in the console. Let's see this in action. When we input 18 into the console, the variable age now holds the value 18. In the next statement, the if statement is asking if the variable age is greater than or equal to 18. Since the value of age is greater than or equal to 18, the condition is returned as true. Because the condition is true, the code within the if statement is executed, and "you can vote" is displayed on the screen. The program then goes on to the next statement in the code, which in this case is another if statement. The if statement checks the condition, "is age greater than 18?" Because this statement is not true, the condition returns false. As a result, the code in the second if statement is not executed and the program ends. Taking the previous example, we can see how this looks in flowchart form. Now let's try an example of our own. We're going to create a method isSquare for the rectangle class that returns true if the rectangle is a square and returns false if it is not. Here are the steps we can take to complete this method. The first thing we need to do is build the method signature. To create the constructor, we should use the method name that is given in the problem and make sure that the return type is Boolean. Because we are returning true/false to the program, we need the return type to be Boolean. Then we need to create an if statement. Because squares have the same width and height, We can figure out if a rectangle is a square by comparing the width and the height of the rectangle. If the height and the width of the rectangle are the same, then we know it's a square. We can then return the value true, indicating that the rectangle is a square. Next, we want to write another if statement that tests if the height and width are not the same. If they are not, then we want to return the value false. We actually don't need to write this method with two if statements. There is a shortcut we can implement to make this problem a little more simple. Because the first if statement compared the width and the height, if they are not the same, then we know immediately that the rectangle is not a square. Since that's the case, we can actually put return false outside of the if statement. This works because the program will stop executing once a return statement is executed. If the if statement is executed, the return statement will return true and stop running the method. If the if statement is not executed, then the return statement outside of the if statement will be executed instead, and false will be returned. We can see in the diagram on the right that the true statement doesn't return back to the statement, as return values effectively end the method. Now that you've learned about if statements, let's get some practice using them in the editor.